She just asked, why did you make the rainbow? Who is teaching these kids? I don't understand. It's terrible. Hey, before we get started, a couple things I want to make you aware of or to remind you of. Okay, first is this is the last Sunday to pick up some invite cards. Guys, you have absolutely worn us out on invite cards. We've had to replenish them every single week. There's a few more out there, I believe. And if you've not picked up some, please do. This is a great invite. And then we're putting some stuff out on social media. And, of course, the banner on the street. We're hoping to have a great crowd next Saturday evening as we just kind of love on our neighbors and give them a great opportunity to make a memory with them and their family here at Hulen Street Church. But the other thing we're doing, and I want to take a little bit of time just kind of unpack it for you a little bit because it's new to us. We've never used it before, is this blessing bag. You might have seen the video, and if you have, just forgive this for a moment because many of you may not have seen the video or you just saw another email from me and just deleted it. But here's what I want you to know. This is a way that we can leverage Halloween in a way we never have before. We recognize that this is the one time of year when our neighbors, and we don't question it, we're not weirded out by it, but our neighbors come actually knocking on our door. Any other time, it's like, what do they want? We know what they want. They want candy, and so they're going to come to our door, and we want to be ready for them, not just with good candy, right? Good candy, Hulen Street. No black licorice, no bit of honeys, none of those orange peanut things, okay? We want them to know that the love of God, not bad candy. So we want to use good candy. But you put that good candy in one of these little cellophane bags, and it says Happy Halloween from, and then you personalize it. So it'd be Happy Halloween from the Hamiltons and Hulen Street Church. And then on the inside, there's a card, if I can get to it here. It's got a little QR code, and they use that QR code to receive an invite to come back the next Sunday. Now, the idea is, and this is all we want to do, is we want to bring people back the next Sunday. The goal is not just to give them a piece of candy, but to bring them back here. And if they come back here, we get some of their information, they're going to be entered to win a drawing for a $100 gift card for their family to use at Urban Air Adventure Park. And so we want to make that something that's attractive to them. And so we're just kind of utilizing the season and the moment just for the kingdom. And so please, we've put together 100 of these bags with 20 of these little cellophane bags. And think about that. If all of those go out on Halloween night next week, that's 2,000 invitations, 2,000 touches of people that will hear and know that Hulen Street Church cares enough to kind of go the extra mile, not just to throw some candy into a bag, but just to create something that invites them to come and be a part of what God is doing here at Hulen Street Church. Okay, so we are in our series now where Jesus is being asked questions and he is asking questions. Now, we're still going to talk today about one of the questions that Jesus is asked. And he's asked a question from a guy that we know as Peter. Peter was one of those disciples, and there's a lot to love about Peter. We're going to get into him in just a minute. A lot of things about Peter that are familiar to us. He's one of those guys that I think we can identify with on a lot of different levels. But this is found in a book called Matthew. And if you're not familiar with the Bible, Matthew is the first book of what's called the New Testament. It's about 2/3 into the whole Bible. It's right about in that area you're going to find Matthew as this New Testament begins. And this is found in Matthew chapter 18. And this is a book, like those first 4 books, we say all the time, those are the biographies of the life and the ministry, and the words and the teachings and miracles of Jesus. And so Matthew chapter 18, Jesus is giving, just some background here, Jesus is giving some instructions on how we are to deal with other believers who have engaged in sin in some way, right? They are Christians who are living consistently unchristian lifestyles. And that we have a responsibility as believers to lovingly and compassionately confront those people with clarity in order to help, not just to condemn, we're not condemning, but to restore. It should always be restorative, not punitive. That's the goal of that kind of confrontation. And so he lays it out. And I love that he lays it out because behind that is the assumption we're going to mess up. So he gives us very clear steps on what to do when we mess up, when we drift from the path, right? When we go, we go astray. What do we do with that? How do we confront that? What do we do with that with one another, right? Lovingly, compassionately, but with clarity and conviction, confronting one another when we know we can do better, right? When we know it could be better. And so they're listening to this, and what's interesting to me is that Peter hears this, but he kind of takes it to the next place. He takes it to the next level. Let me show you what I mean. Verse 21, Peter asks the question. Here's the question of the day that Jesus has asked. Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother when he sins against me? Basically, Peter is saying, hey, listen, I hear what you're saying about what happens when other believers are living in or engaged in sin. But my question is what happens when that sin goes from being general to being personal? What happens when another believer offends me or betrays me or insults me or disappoints me? What do I do with that then? How many times, he says, do I have to forgive them? And I love how he says it. He says, when, not if. How many times shall I forgive? When he sins against me, right? The recognition that we are going to do this. We are going to get crossways occasionally. It's going to happen. There are going to be times where I will disappoint you and you will disappoint me, and I will upset you and you will upset me, and I will offend you and you will offend me. And we have to be big boys and girls and realize that's going to happen, right? We're going to do this and we're going to hurt one another. That's what happens in relationships. And there's a sense that we have to be a little bit ready for that and be vulnerable about it. But what do? How do we make sure that we keep these relationships intact and as healthy as we possibly can, even when we recognize that we are going to do this to one another? We're going to hurt one another. So what do I do with that? He says, well, how do I handle it when another believer, another Christian, does something against me, to offend me, to hurt me? And then he tries to answer his own question. How many times do I forgive them? He says, up to 7 times. Now, here's what you got to know. Peter, I think at this moment, is really trying to impress Jesus. Because what you and I don't understand is that Peter grows up in a world in which the rabbis have taught that you are only required to forgive another person who offends you 3 times, right? 3 strikes and you're out, essentially, in that world. And then you can cut that person off and you don't have to forgive them anymore because they have reached the limit of forgiveness. And Peter, I think he understands, like a lot of them do, like they always want to kind of go above and beyond, right? That's what religion always kind of motivates us to do. We think we need to do more. Like if this is what I'm supposed to do, I can go above and beyond. I could do a little bit more and I'm just going to be better off. And that's all he does. He goes above and beyond. And so now he says, hey, do I forgive them up to 7 times? And on its face, it looks like he's being super generous, right? This is more than double the amount of forgiveness than what was required. The problem here that Peter doesn't see, that we often fall victim to, is the fact that even though he's increased the number, he has not changed the ultimate outcome. Because it's based on the assumption that there is a limit to my forgiveness. There's a limit to my forgiveness. Now, let me pause for a moment. I want to be real clear about something. Occasionally, there are relationships that you and I will have to end because they're unhealthy or they're toxic and they're detrimental to us and to the other person. And so sometimes, and I think in extreme cases, that we have to end a relationship. We have to set up barriers to that relationship. But just because you end the relationship does not mean you don't offer forgiveness. You can still forgive and be free from that while also choosing to end a toxic, unhealthy relationship. Does that make sense? So I want to be clear that we understand that. So, but Peter operates from the assumption is that there's some sort of limit to forgiveness. And here's the problem with that. Even when you extend the limit, all you have done is to delay the inevitable. Whether that limit is 3 or whether that limit is 7. When you set a limit for the number of times you extend forgiveness, you will eventually reach that limit, I believe, in every relationship you have. Peter thinks he's being magnanimous, right? He's being so generous, so righteous, up to 7 times. But what would it look like? Think about this, play this out. What would life look like? Not if we went by the rabbi's limit of 3, but even if we went by Peter's limit of 7, what would our lives look like if we kept count of all the times we have been hurt or betrayed or disappointed or offended or insulted by someone else? What would your life look like? What would my life look like? Think about that. I wouldn't be married now, that's for sure. I wouldn't have a relationship with my kids. I wouldn't have a relationship with many of you. And if we did have a relationship, it would only be a matter of time until you'd have to pull out your notebook. Because listen, if we're going to keep count, we all got to keep a notebook. We'll keep a little notebook with the name of all the people that we're in a relationship with, and we'll have little tick marks next to that name. And then at some point or another, I'm going to do something, and that 7th tick mark is going to go right there next to my name, and our relationship will be over. That's what happens. That is the inevitable result. And what you have there, it's well-meaning, right? But it is a disfigured view of forgiveness that only results in a wake of broken relationships. Relationships that are broken or relationships that are on their way to being broken. And so Jesus knows that he has to straighten Peter's well-meaning but broken version of forgiveness out. And so Jesus answers him. He says, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. In some Bibles, in some scripture, that's also translated 70 times 7. I kind of identify with that one. Both of them are good, they're fine, but he says 70 times 7. And so you could say what he does here for Peter is he answers with a math problem. Now, here's what I love about Peter. Peter's awesome. He's enthusiastic. He is bold. He is brave. But sometimes Peter's not the sharpest knife in the drawer. And this is how I identify with Peter. I wasn't good at math either. I struggle with math, and I think Peter does too at this moment. And so Jesus says, hey, it's 70 times 7. And Peter just kind of goes, carry the 1. And Jesus goes, no, Peter, it's 400. Never mind. Sit down. Let me tell you a story. How about that, Peter? Will you understand a story, Peter? And Peter's like, yeah, I can do a story because I can do a story. So he wants to explain what forgiveness is and what forgiveness looks like. And now he launches into what is called a parable. He tells a story for better understanding. And he says, therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. Let's stop right there just for a moment. What is the kingdom of heaven? The kingdom of heaven is when you and I come into an acknowledgement of, right, a recognition of both the reality of and the authority of God. Right? When our lives, our decisions, our values, we work to align our lives, decisions, values, relationships, conversations, how we spend our money, how we deal with one another, right? When we begin to try to align our lives as best we can, we're not perfect in it, but when we begin to align our lives under the reality and the authority of God, that's the king, that you're in the kingdom of heaven, right? It's kind of a shorthand for saying someone who is a Christian, right? And you live in this kingdom. This is what the kingdom of heaven is, what life was supposed to be like, how life was meant to be lived. And he says, okay, here's what the kingdom of heaven is like. When it comes to forgiveness, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. And as he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. Now, this is kind of lost on us because you and I do not understand that 10,000 talents was actually an obscene amount of money. It was an otherworldly kind of amount of money. It's not an amount of money that would even enter into the realm of possibility for anyone in that day and that time. Let me give you a frame of reference. We have through records taken at that time that the entire sum of all of the taxes that was gathered in Palestine for the Romans at that time, right? It totaled a total amount of 800 talents, right? That's all the taxes for that region going to Rome, 800 talents. This man owes 10,000 talents. The best we can understand, the best we can estimate is that is roughly the modern equivalent of about $10 million. And so the servant, it says in verse 26, fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. Here's the problem. He can't. Paying back everything is an impossibility based on the economics of that day. In the economics of that day, a man would have to work, listen to this, 20 years to earn 1 talent. 20 years to earn 1 talent. What does that mean? He's going to have to work probably equivalent to about 200,000 years to pay back the debt, right? Even if he started then and worked nonstop until today, he'd still be short by 198,000 years. This guy is so far in debt. Dave Ramsey can't help this guy. I don't care how many envelopes he has. He is not getting out of this debt. But look what he does. I mean, he offers this, like, I'll pay it back. Just give me time. I can pay it back. He can't pay it back. And he won't pay it back. But that's always our first reaction. We always rely on ourselves. We fall back on ourselves. I can do this. I can fix this. I can solve this. And sometimes we just can't. Sometimes it's beyond us. And so the servant's master, the king, it says in verse 27, took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. Now, this is a turn of events that nobody sees coming. Not only would you not owe somebody 10 million talents, no one would forgive $10 million or 10,000 talents. And what's interesting to me is, what does this guy ask for? What does he ask for of the king? He asks for time. What does the king give him? He gives him forgiveness. He gives him mercy. He doesn't give him time in order to make things right. He completely wipes out the debt, and he walks out of that room free and clear. His $10 million debt is erased. Now, here's the problem. We think, well, where's the justice in this? It doesn't seem quite fair. The one thing you always have to keep in mind when we are dealing with forgiveness, and forgiveness is the essential element to all healthy relationships. We're going to have to extend and receive forgiveness. When you extend forgiveness, it's never free. Forgiveness and the forgiveness of another always costs something. You can forgive someone and you can be forgiven of something, but the debt, whatever that is, listen, the debt does not magically go away. It does not dissolve into the ether as if it never happened at all. So you have a choice here. Like you're faced with someone who has offended you, who's sinned against you. You can do one or two things here. You could demand justice. And what does that mean? Well, if you demand justice and you get justice, you will be repaid back exactly what you lost. Whatever they took from you, whether it was financially or emotionally, right? However you have been hurt, you will extract the same amount of hurt upon that other person. Make sense? So you can get justice, you can have justice, right? And they're gonna pay exactly the same amount that they took from you. Or you can extend forgiveness. And what happens with forgiveness? Forgiveness means you don't demand to be repaid. You actually, yourself, you absorb the cost. And the king, in erasing the debt, doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. He still loses 10,000 talents. But forgiveness means you and I, we let go. We surrender our right to be compensated. Whether that is emotional or financial or relational or professional, whatever that looks like, whatever category you want to put it in. When we forgive someone else, we actually surrender our right. We have a right. We can be compensated, but we surrender our right to be compensated. And that's what gets in the way of our forgiveness. That's what gets in the way of our mercy. That's why we want there to be a limit on forgiveness. Because that costs a lot, and that is not always easy, and sometimes it's even painful. And we cannot forgive oftentimes because we have become so consumed with what we stand to lose because we are constantly keeping score. Remember, Peter's thinking he's doing good, that he's being righteous by just increasing the number required to forgive to 7. And Jesus says, no, Peter, not 7, but 70 times 7. If he were able to work that out, like, what, really? You're going to extend the limit to 490 times? Who could possibly keep count of all the relationships and all the offenses for all that time? And Jesus would say, exactly. That's exactly what I'm driving at. That's exactly what I want you to understand. Don't keep count. Quit keeping score. The master, the king, in this moment, he is moved by the servant's pain, and he extends an extravagant grace over an obscene debt in order to ease his suffering. No, let's just take 1 minute to understand. Like, think about this. If he did have 10,000 talents, how do you think he came about those 10,000 talents? It was probably through extortion or cooking the books or through some other nefarious ways. Like he didn't come by it honestly. And even if he did that, right, he's done it in such a way that was unjust, right? But then he's also, what has he done with the money since then? If he doesn't have enough to pay back any of it, it means he squandered it. Like, this guy is wrong on all levels. But yet the king, who understands this, forgives him anyway, which makes what happens next so shocking. This is the moment, I think, when Jesus drops this kind of next nugget of the story. His audience kind of begins to murmur. They begin to kind of get upset. There's an injustice that happens here that they want to deal with. Verse 28, he says, but when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. And he grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. Now, what does he owe him? It says 100 denarii. Now, a Roman denarius was about the size of a dime. It was about twice as thick, and it was the equivalent of a common day's wages, whether it was a normal laborer or a Roman soldier. So if you add all that up, what that means is he goes out and he finds the guy who owes him roughly a little bit more than 3 months' wages. And what happens? His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, be patient with me and I will pay you back. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Here's what's interesting is he probably can. If a little bit of patience is extended, that's not a debt that is insurmountable. He could actually make good on his debt. But he refused, it says. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. And when the other servants saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed and went and told their master everything that had happened. And the master called the servants in and said, you wicked servant, I canceled all that debt of yours when you begged me to. You should have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you. And then it says, in his anger, the master, the king, turned him over to the jailers to be tortured until he could pay back all that he owes. He ends up losing more than he would have ever lost in the first place. And you look at that and goes, how does this guy, how is he not aware of what has just been offered him, extended him, what he just received? How does he not connect the dots between what he experienced and then what he demanded? See, just moments before, he was in a similar but worse situation. And his fellow servant used the same exact words that he used to plead for his life. But yet he was forgiven, but he did not forgive. He was offered mercy, but he was not one to extend mercy. And look at what Jesus says here. And we need to unpack this verse to understand it. So Jesus concludes with a warning. He says, this is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother from your heart. That's a harsh word. This is how God's going to deal with you unless you won't be forgiven unless you learn to forgive. That's what it seems to be saying. It seems to be indicating you're only eligible for mercy if you have the ability to extend mercy. You can only hope to receive forgiveness if you first offer forgiveness. Here's the problem with that. On its face, what does that look like? It looks like karma, right? It's exactly what it looks like. It looks like the good that you do will be returned to you, or the bad that you do will come back on you. right? The universe will always square the accounts, right? The universe will always deliver a justice, the justice that you deserve, whether good or bad. And it looks like Jesus is telling us that either you can earn your salvation, like I can earn my salvation. If I go off and offer forgiveness to everybody, then God will forgive me. So I can earn my salvation by being good and righteous and merciful and forgiving, right? Or if I'm not merciful or gracious, and I'm not forgiving, I can lose my salvation. But both of those are wrong. And what do we do with that? I mean, how do we understand that? How do we interpret that? Here's how I hear this. Here's how I see this. This man did not lose his salvation. He didn't gain his salvation, but he did not lose his salvation for the simple fact that you cannot lose what you do not have. Now, listen, I recognize it's super convenient for me to say, well, he wasn't a Christian in the first place, right? He wasn't a believer in the first place. The reason he didn't extend mercy because he didn't experience mercy in a genuine way. And I don't understand that. That's a really easy way to alleviate the tension. But in reality, Jesus tells us all we know and all that we need to know about the true condition of this man's heart. And here's the problem. Despite the mercy he was offered and given, it did not alter his heart. It didn't bring him to salvation. He experienced mercy. He received it, but he wasn't transformed by it. Let me show you what I mean. Verse 28, go back a step to verse 28. But when the servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. What does that tell us? Well, it tells us he found him. What does that mean? This was not a coincidental meeting on the street. This wasn't just a chance, like bumping into a guy who owed him some money. He went out and found him. He went out looking for him. He went out hunting for him. He intentionally pursued him. And he wanted to go and collect the debt from him. Now, why? After he's been forgiven of all this debt, why does he go out and intentionally hunt down a guy who owes him money? Because he's still afraid. See, what this indicates to us is that the relationship he has with the king is still broken. The relationship with the king who offered him a mercy, who gave him forgiveness, is still fractured. He doesn't know the king. He's not in relationship with the king. He doesn't trust the king. And why is that? Because he's thinking to himself, this is too good. It's too good to be true. And he still lives in fear. And he thinks at any moment, he's just playing with me, right? Kings don't do this. People don't do this. People don't wipe out $10 million in debt. So any moment now, there's going to be a knock at my door, and his guards are going to drag me out of my house bring him before his throne, and there's going to be a switch that is flipped, and he's going to be angry, and I can't trust that he won't come back on me. And really, he doesn't trust the character of the king. He doesn't trust the goodness of the king because he doesn't know the king. Which means he's not in relationship with him. He hasn't put his faith in him. Does that make sense? And so what he's got to do is he's going to go out and he's going to find all the people that owe him some money. He's going to liquidate some of his assets. He's going to scrape together as much money as he possibly can so that when the king comes calling, because he still thinks the king's going to show up one day and demand payment. And so he's got to get as much together as he possibly can because he ultimately does not trust the king. He doesn't put his faith in the king. Despite what he's still experienced, he still has this distorted view of his king. And what Jesus is doing here, he sees this opportunity. When Peter says, hey, how many times do I have to forgive someone who sins against me? Up to 7 times? Peter sees an opportunity, or Jesus sees an opportunity, not just for Peter, but for all of us, to paint a picture of who God really is, what God's really like. And some of you need to know this because you are operating like this servant. You are operating with a broken, fractured, distorted picture of who God is. And because of that, you don't feel like you can trust him. You don't feel like you can truly put your faith in him. because you think it's just going to come back on you. I read a book a few months back, really great book. I have given it to the staff. The elders and I are reading it, called Gentle and Lowly. Great book. And the guy who wrote it, Dane Ortland, he writes this. I just want to quote one little part of the book. I think it's really good, speaking to this issue. He says, God is unswervingly just. He is. He is unswervingly just. But, listen to this. He asks the question, what is God's disposition? He says, what is God on the edge of his seat most eager to do? Now, I want you to imagine something for a moment. If I caught you off guard, or if you caught me off guard, what is it that leaps out of you before you have the opportunity to compose yourself? Think about it. If you catch me off guard, what leaps out of me before I have the opportunity to compose myself? Whatever comes out of you most naturally, that is your disposition. That's his point. And then he says this, if you catch God off guard, what leaps out of him most freely is blessing, mercy, forgiveness, and love. And he draws this distinction between God's natural work and God's strange work. What's the difference between God's natural work and his strange work? Well, a natural work is something that comes naturally to you, something you're naturally good at. Some of you have things you're good at. You're naturally good at some things. Some of you have things in your life that you're not so good at. I have things about life I'm not so good at. That's a strange work. Things that are awkward to us, that we can do, but we do it awkwardly. We can do, but we do it kind of left-footedly, right? And he says, here's what we do. When we talk about God and we think about God, we think God's natural work, the thing he is most inclined to do, the thing that comes most naturally to him is condemnation, judgment, and anger. That's God's natural work as we see it. But his point is, those are actually God's strange work. That God's most natural work is his mercy and love and forgiveness. So he's painting a picture here of who God really is, but also who we were meant to be. That we offer mercy because we've been extended mercy. We forgive because we have been forgiven. And sometimes when you and I hold on to things, when we hold our grudges, all right, we hold on to our offenses and we don't forgive like we can. You know why we do that? It's because we can't imagine that we've ever been forgiven of more than what we are asked to forgive someone of. But that's the point. When God asks us to be forgiving with one another, we have to operate from a position, from a disposition of acknowledging that I will never, no matter how much is ever asked of me, I will never be asked to forgive anyone of anything that is greater than what I've already been forgiven of myself, than what God has already forgiven me of. And if I can keep that in the front of me, if I can keep what God has done on my behalf in front of me, then that's going to make it so much easier for me to extend grace to you, because I know that whatever grace I extend to you will always pale in comparison to the grace God has extended to me. And so when we understand that, we know that, we operate with that, it changes. It changes how we deal with one another. And it changes how forgiveness can be a little more easily offered. See, my hope today is this. My hope that for some of you in this room, whether you're online or whether you're here, my real hope, my real prayer has been over the course of this week is that God would open your eyes to who he really is. That he would dismantle the assumptions you've made about him. That he would reveal himself to you in a way that would convince you that he's worth your faith, your trust, and that you would put your faith and trust in him, that you would follow him, that you would begin to align your life with his reality and his authority. Make sense? That you would see the difference between his natural work and his strange work. And it's not what you thought. It's not what you ever expected. That you would leave here today and you would say, you know what, I know something now. I know that God is good, and I'm not gonna question his character. I'm gonna trust it. I'm gonna put my faith in it. I'm gonna live in the reality of it. I'm gonna receive forgiveness, and I'm gonna offer it to those who are around me. You take a moment as we close here today, just reflect on that. Let's bow our heads just for a moment. I know it sounds kind of strange. We do this sometimes just to kind of carve out a little space for us that we don't usually have. I know we are sitting here in a crowd of people, but we bow our heads. We just kind of think through, just as best we can, what God has said to us. And if today God has really opened your heart and your eyes to who he really is, and you think, man, that's not what I thought God was all about. That's not who I thought God was. That's a God I want to know more about. That's a God I want to reconsider. That's a God I maybe want to follow. Here's what I'm going to ask you to do. Heads bowed, your eyes closed. I would ask you just to indicate that on your card. There are several options on the bottom of your card on how you can take a next step in your faith journey. And if you would just look through that card and find the one that best kind of resonates with where you are in your faith journey, would you do me a favor and just put a mark in that circle? And you'll let us know how we need to just connect with you and what conversation we need to have with you, because that's what we want to do. We want to walk with you in understanding who God is. And not only that, who you were meant to be. Father, give us the courage and the boldness to do that. Give us the ability to be honest with ourselves about who we thought you were and who we have been and become based on our incorrect assumptions about you. Correct us where we have gotten it wrong about who you are. Correct our hearts where we've gotten it wrong about your character and your heart and your mercy. Help us to understand what your most natural work is and respond to that. Stir our affections towards that. Change our lives, our relationships because of that. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.